So, hello everybody, a very warm virtual welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in today's first fully remote and entirely lockdown compliant co-opting AI event on finance. Now, I do understand that these are very challenging times for all of us, so I am particularly grateful to the terrific panelists who I'll introduce in a minute for joining me today. I am grateful that my team helped put together a whole new tech setup for us to do this. And I'm thankful that you showed up and helped us keep the conversation going. My name is Dr. Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist and I work on design and inequality in the context of artificial intelligence and also artificial intelligence policy. I'm currently a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. I'm also a fellow with NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the Tandon School of Engineering. And I also currently have the honor of being one of the inaugural fellows with the Future Imagination Collaboratory at NYU's Tisch School for the Arts. I convene the Co-opting AI series, and I also curate the technology section with public books. Now, before we get going, and before I say a few words about the series and introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge that I, and I assume quite a few of you, am gathered on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. NYU also acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land NYU is located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, before I introduce the panelists and today's topic, I want to say a few words about the event series. Essentially, the Co-opting AI series do what it says on the tin, as the Brits tend to say. They set out to co-opt AI. Now, what does that mean? The thing we call AI, artificial intelligence, increasingly plays a role in all kinds of social interactions and organizations, from production and consumption to transport and navigation, job hunting and recruiting, securing a loan, finding a place to live, reading the news, communicating with others, all the way to policing and criminal justice. As this is happening, we are engulfed by a narrative that positions AI as the determinant for our collective future above all else. Above all else, I think this could turn out to be a very slippery slope. With all the noise around the technological aspects of AI, we are increasingly distracted or seemingly rendered paralyzed from asking what is really at stake as we move forward into a new socio-technical future. And I think it is at this point that AI comes actually in handy. AI prompts us to reevaluate big questions around power, democracy, and inequality, and what it means to be human. We should take that prompt seriously. We should co-opt the AI discourse to keep asking these bigger questions and ask them not just from an economical or technological point of view, but include diverse social, political, historical perspectives, but without going down the rabbit hole of techno-skepticism. And this is really what the Co-opting AI series are all about. They're about flipping the AI script and taking AI as a cue to have broader conversations about society, design, technology, economy, inequality, and democracy. Now, this series would not be possible without the generous support and sponsorship of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and the 370J project, and also NYU's Department of Technology, Culture, and Society. Now, today, we are gonna dedicate our discussion to exploring the intersection between artificial intelligence and finance. Three fantastic speakers, Rumman Chowdhury, Juan Pablo Pardo-Guerra, and Sarah Quinn, have joined us to ponder questions such as, what is the connection between AI and other forms of automation in the financial industry? How do social relations constitute AI as an economic technology? And how and in what ways do finance and AI intersect with other regimes? Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists. First up will be JP Pardo-Guerra, who I actually overlapped with at the London School of Economics. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
JP is assistant professor of sociology at UC San Diego. He received his BSc in physics from UNAM in Mexico and his PhD in science and technology studies from the University of Edinburgh. His research explores the connections between markets, cultures, and technologies. Combining theoretical insights from economic sociology and science and technology studies, he has conducted historical research on the automation of stock exchanges, the development of national financial infrastructures, and the emergence of algorithmic and high-frequency trading. In 2019, last year, JP published his latest book entitled Automating Finance, Infrastructures, Engineers, and the Making of Electronic Markets. And I guess we'll hear a little bit about that today. This book examines the moral, political, and organizational struggles that were central to the automation of modern stock markets. He is additionally interested in studying the consequences of standardized quality evaluation exercises on career structures and research practices, as well as the role of knowledge and information infrastructures in contemporary societies, including discussions about the challenges and possibilities of big data. Following JP will be Rumman Chowdhury, who is currently the global lead for responsible AI at Accenture Applied Intelligence, where she works with C-suite clients to create cutting-edge technical solutions for ethical, explainable, and transparent artificial intelligence. Rumman serves as a co-chair of the RSA Citizen AI Jury and actively participates in IEEE standards committees, the Partnership on AI, as an advisor to the UK House of Lords Parliamentary Group on Artificial Intelligence, which was, by the way, one of the first who came out with a report on artificial intelligence, and other global AI and ethics organizations. She has presented at multiple international governing bodies, including the United Nations, the OECD, and the UK Parliament. Rumman has been featured in international media, including the Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, MIT Tech Review, BBC Access, Charter TV, CRN, and the list goes on and on and on. You will have seen Rumman. She's also a member of Brain Trust, a community of experts for protocol, a tech magazine by Politico. And closing the panel presentations will be Dr. Sarah Quinn, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington and is currently a member of the Institute for Advanced Study. She uses historical research and case studies to investigate the intersection of political institutions, market practices, and systems of moralization. She is the author of American Bonds, How Credit Markets Shaped the Nation, also out last year, which explains how political institutions became involved in the nation's lending practices. Her research has been funded by the Institute of New Economic Thinking and published in the American Journal of Sociology, Sociological Theory, and other venues. Quinn is a current faculty affiliate of Urban Ed UW and a past fellow of the Michigan Society of Fellows. She has a BA in sociology from Smith College and an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. I am delighted to welcome such a great group of fellow sociologists. Now, before we get going with JP, just a few words about housekeeping. We will be seeing 10 to 15-minute presentations from each panelist. Then, meanwhile, my team will collect questions you may have through Twitter. The IPK Twitter account is NYU_IPK. We will then have a panel discussion and then turn over to Q&A. Now, unfortunately, we do not have live captioning for this event. However, we will have closed captions for the recording that will go up after the streaming. Now, thank you so much and welcome, JP.
Thank you so very much. Let me try to set this up. Thank you, Mona, for the invitation. It's a joy being part of such a terrific panel. And I'm really glad to see that things are continuing despite the craziness in the world right now. So let me try to set up the presentation. Can you see it? Is it visible?
Yes.
Great, awesome. So the the thing that I'm interested in terms of finance and financial markets is the process through which they transitioned from being face-to-face centers of social interaction merely 30 years ago to entirely online digital setups. And one of the, you can see this in very stark ways through how the visual representations of finance have changed during these 3 decades that have been central to the automation of financial markets and the emergence of activities such as high frequency trading, algorithmic trading, and so forth. Merely 1 or 2 generations ago, financial markets were physical spaces where face-to-face activity was central to the way finance occurred. Trading was moderated or was conducted in these very rich, densely cultural spaces, trading floors, where people would meet to make sense of the world and make markets in the process of interacting and communicating. Today, of course, markets are not like this. The New York Stock Exchange still has a floor, but arguably it could be seen as one of the best props for online or for TV news and newscasts. It's not really the site of activity. The site of activity is now servers many miles away where most of the transactions take place. The representation of markets today is more like this. It's an electronic engine where investors, anonymous investors, meet to transact in fractions of a second, millions and millions of shares over the day. So how did this happen? I explore this process of automation in my book, Automating Finance, where I try to make sense of the organizational pressures and organizational stories that are behind the automation of these systems, stock exchanges that went from trading floors to electronic matching engines. And the reason why I think this is an important story is that it uncovers all these hidden sources of innovation and automation that we often don't focus on and that we often forget. In particular, our stories of automation and our stories of the rise of artificial intelligence and all these novel technologies tend to be coached in terms of visionary technologists who were central to the process of innovation. When we think of how everyday devices like iPhones and computers were produced, we think necessarily of these mythical creators, these mythical managers that were at the core of organizations, guiding how things ought to be automated into the future. And what my work tries to stress is a completely different story of automation, one that is actually challenging because it forces us to see parts of organizations, of institutions, of industries and markets that we often ignore because they are largely invisible. So the story that I tell is the story of how markets automated but not by looking at these mythical inventors, these heroic innovators, but rather by looking at people who are invisible in many respects to the market and its operators. And the thing I do in the book is I explore 2 stories. One is the story of the London Stock Exchange and the British equities market. And the other one is the story of the US national market system. And what I want to focus on is the British case because I think it better exemplifies how markets were automated over time. So meet the London Stock Exchange in the 1960s. This is a photo from about 1965, 1968, from the floor of the London Stock Exchange. Much like the New York Stock Exchange, it was a setting where people would meet face-to-face to trade and make markets happen. One of the interesting things about this photo is that you see only individuals on the floor that were trading, but you do not see the post-trade operations because those post-trade operations, which are central to the financial system, things like clearing and settlement, would take place outside of the trading floor in the basements and alcoves of the organization. Literally the basements. People were hidden away because things like clearing and settlement, the the act of matching trades after the trade was agreed on in the trading floor was something considered more mechanical, of less status, and of less importance. It was nonetheless a very critical part of the system and something that people saw um, as an unnecessary expense. Trading was something culturally important to the exchange. Settlement and clearing wasn't as important, but it was nonetheless costly because it required lots of humans matching tickets, matching trades after the trading day. So the way automation started is in a very unsuspecting way. It didn't start in the trading floor, it started rather in the periphery of the organization, in settlement and clearing, where the stock exchange purchased some of the first computers to mechanize the process of matching trades after they were done and agreed on the floor. Of course, one of the things that happens when you get computers is that you need people to maintain them. And the problem that the stock exchange faced after a couple of years was that making these systems operational and making sure that they were always operational required bringing in experts into the organization that would maintain and develop these systems into the future. These individuals arrived in the stock exchange in London in the 1960s, early 1970s, and were largely considered sort of plebs, as one of them mentioned. They were very lowly individuals. They were not seen as members of the exchange. They were not members of the exchange. They were hired help to work on those newfangled computers in the basement. They were thus very invisible. They were very sort of forgotten and unseen within the organization. But this very invisibility gave them tremendous flexibility to develop systems that would slowly alter the way the market operated. Initially, what they did was they took some of the extra computing capacity that the stock exchange had. The stock exchange bought computers without really knowing how to use them outside of clearing and settlement, and had all this extra capacity just sitting there. What these techies did was they took this extra capacity and they put it to use in novel devices that were interesting and slowly eroded the way the stock exchange worked. One of these was a very simple device that tried to mimic this image. This is how most member firms of the London Stock Exchange would get information off the floor in the 1960s. Those who wanted would have a clerk, the guy in the top hat, write the prices of some select shares on a whiteboard, and those would be video transmitted into the offices of member firms. What the techies realized is that the new computers could be put to a new use by digitizing some of this process. And so they developed the first price visualization system in London that made prices digital for the very first time in the history of British markets. This was hugely successful because people could sit in their offices, watch the market, and didn't have to be physically in the market, and could relax a little bit more. So it became a very successful service provided by the London Stock Exchange to its members that fed into the capacity of these technologists to develop even more systems. So slowly, by the early mid-1970s, the techies started moving away from the basement. They started populating other bits of the stock exchange, never the trading floor itself, always the periphery of the trading floor. They never really touched the trading floor because that was such an important sacred element of the organization. The handful of engineers that were hired in the 1960s, early 1970s had grown to a few hundreds in the late 1970s, early 1980s, so much so that by the mid 1980s, they sort of amounted to a few thousand technologists working quite visibly across the organization in a number of projects that had to do with information dissemination, digitization of data, transmission of data, et cetera, et cetera. The trading floor was still the core of the market. That was unchallenged. It wasn't automated. It wasn't even mechanized. It was still a face-to-face environment. But in the 1980s, the techies got the opportunity to shine when a shock to the financial system in the form of deregulation, the so-called Big Bang, forced the stock exchange to change the way it was working. And this is when the techies could really invade the floor in very significant ways. They started deploying systems that would emulate in distinct manners the physicality and the informational richness of the trading floor. For example, this device on your screens, it's called a trigger screen, which through color and movement emulates the activity of the 100 most popular shares in the market. This was hugely successful. Once it was introduced, lots of the traders that were very used to the trading floor found being on the trading floor actually quite useless and abandoned the trading floor soon after that. And indeed, a few weeks after this Big Bang, this moment of deregulation, the trading floor, this institution that had been central to the way finance operated in London, was largely deserted. This is despite the fact that the organization had spent millions of pounds rekitting the trading floor to make it useful post Big Bang. They really trusted the trading floor would survive as this important technology for making sense of the economic world. But what the techies had done by the 1980s, what they had done by the time of Big Bang, was essentially erode and transform the way finance operated very slowly, one step at a time, to make the trading floor largely irrelevant. So why is this story interesting? What does it say about automation? One of the fascinating things about the history of financial markets is that a lot of the automation happened without people really thinking about automation as an objective. Automation and the rise of novel techniques of trading, novel possibilities, and new institutional patterns in the financial system was the result of lots of slow changes that were largely invisible because they were happening in the sidelines of the organization. They were happening outside of the purview of regulators. Regulators didn't care about technology. They didn't regulate technology as an object of their concern. So lots of these surprises that happened were really there because of this very long, invisible process of innovation that we often ignore. And this is really the key thing or the key lesson from the history of financial automation, that it wasn't a project. It wasn't something planned. It was something that sort of happened. And knowing why it sort of happened is useful for trying to understand where we should be placing attention today for the drastic, radical innovations that might transform the financial sphere in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, JP. Next up, we have Rumman, please. You're on mute.
Let me unmute myself. Rookie mistake. JP, thank you. It's a really good lead-in to the work I do. What a fabulous historical framing. So as Mona mentioned, I lead responsible AI at Accenture, massive consulting firm. And in that practice, I create qualitative and quantitative methodologies for understanding things like algorithmic bias, fairness, explainability, and transparency. I suppose unsurprisingly to anybody in finance, my number one clients are financial institutions. And you've had a bit of a crash course in financial risk management, how people think about it, and how the financial services industry has evolved. So my story kind of picks up where you've left off with the automation of things like trading, et cetera, and the increasing use of models and quantitative methodologies to not just do trading, but things like credit risk scoring, algorithmic assessments, model assessments. And a lot of these regulations started post the 2008 financial crisis, where there was increasing regulations on financial services industries. What we found is that most of these organizations and companies started to really think critically internally at the institutional risk metrics. So now when when people say risk and financial risk, my sort of superficial external understanding before I got to know this world a lot better was that, oh, risk is just kind of about sort of the riskiness of a trade or sort of financial risk. But actually, post 2008, we saw a much, much broader brushstroke painted when it came to risk. And here's where I think we intersect quite a bit with the social sciences, which is frankly why I find this narrative very interesting. There started to be increasing conversations about things like compensation schemes and compensation structures, understanding institutional and organizational incentives and how they align with major decisions that individuals make and then snowball to the kinds of risk introduced to a corporation. One of the biggest kinds of risk that large financial firms look at today is the notion of market risk. So how a few massive players can significantly impact the entire economic well-being of a country or the entire world. So specifically, if I talk a bit about the work I do with clients, there's this process called model risk management, and traditionally it applies to high risk type of models that are used. And usually the number one example people use is things like credit risk scoring. So assessing how risky a potential applicant is and whether or not they should be allowed to receive credit. And what is interesting, and when we look at other industries that are not as developed in terms of the use of algorithms as financial services, there's a lot we can learn. The notion of things like risk tiering, assessing riskiness, creating the appropriate documentation, and the right kinds of control processes. So, over the past little more than a decade, more than that, I'd say, companies in the financial services industry have really thought very deeply about how to assess the individuals making decisions in models and the models themselves, and how to create the appropriate kinds of paperwork for regulatory bodies, legal institutions, et cetera. So in a nutshell, a model risk management process will come out with a very long, very long document that's assessed from multiple different directions. What is the kind of riskiness introduced by the model? There's this notion of something called stress testing, which is what it kind of sounds like, a testing for extreme situations and how a model will respond. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the work I do, which has been about thinking through how a model risk management in its current form may be insufficient in thinking through the challenges raised by artificial intelligence. Sharing my screen. So, I will not go through all of the slides here. I was joking with the panelists earlier that these are very consulting-y slides, very text heavy, but I'll sort of talk through at a high level what I think is super interesting and I think relevant for this conversation. So traditional model risk tiering and model risk management thinks about the impact of the model. So within the framework of how the model is being used, what is the impact of this model? What sort of risks does it introduce? So things like portfolio exposure, as I mentioned, this notion of stress testing, loss impact, the risks inherent due to notions like fraud, and customer impact, and this idea of criticality. Now, with AI, what we actually introduce is increasing uncertainty, and the field of risk management, really what it's about is uncertainty mitigation. So what is the intrinsic risk due to these AI and ML models? And the term I've been using, even outside of my financial services clients, is the term nonlinear risk. So today we think, okay, well, I'm creating a credit scoring model. Let me make sure it is not violating any laws on the notion of credit scoring, i.e. it does not discriminate against a protected class. With AI, we have to think almost tangentially about the kinds of risk introduced by our models. So the notion of market risk or organizational risk or reputational risk expanded quite a bit. For example, when we saw the Apple Card debate from a few months ago, somebody being denied credit based on a model that was considered opaque. Now, where this whole narrative fell apart was not that the model was not compliant. My guess is that it probably was compliant, but that there was a loss of communication between this individual and the customer service rep that they dealt with. So now we're rethinking even what we consider to be how models should be revised and reviewed. And increasingly, we are using quite complex models in financial service industries and across many industries in things that were not traditionally high risk areas. For example, employee experience and human resources. So if we look at, SR 11.7 are the US federal guidelines on model risk management. And again, I promise I will not read this whole very dense slide, but what's quite interesting here is we have 3 high level areas that SR 11.7 talks about: how to audit model development, implementation, and use, model validation, and governance policies and controls. And that's quite interesting because, again, when we think about the field of auditing AI models, we think a lot about the sort of quantitative assessment, the bias checks, et cetera. But a very big, and actually the biggest component, if we just count number of lines here for SR 11.7, are the notion of governance policies and controls. So this is mapping out things like your risk appetite, understanding auditability and traceability, and creating systems of accountability. And again, if we think about the challenges that we're facing today in the AI ethics space, there's this very common theme today of a lot of talks, papers, et cetera, of driving principles into practice. And essentially SR 11.7, while it is not necessarily specifically about AI and it's not specifically about ethics, it is about driving principles into practice. And when we think about AI and ML models, here are the ways in which we need to start thinking increasingly about auditability and traceability mechanism, appropriateness, and how they align specifically with 11.7 guidelines. The last slide I'll show you and talk about is the areas of risk. So I've been using this term, and like I said, I think sometimes there's not quite a clear understanding of what risk means unless you are somebody who literally works in this particular area of risk. Compliance risk is what we usually think about. Are you breaking the law? But if ethics and AI were simply about compliance and we'd all be lawyers. I am not a lawyer, Mona's not a lawyer. So there's more than just compliance. So there's the risk introduced by data, and data quality is increasingly a topic of discussion. And sometimes there's, sort of conflicting rules and regulations. For example, you're not allowed to hold certain types of data on sensitive classes, for example, like gender, but then how are you supposed to assess your models for gender bias if you cannot necessarily hold data about gender? There is a notion of security risk, which has always existed, this idea of types of attacks in cybersecurity. However, machine learning introduces new types of security risks, for example, inference attacks. In other words, like you can determine how a model works based on the output and then use that to basically game the model or hack the model. Another way, the most popular way, would be poisoning training data. And then, of course, challenges of privacy and security. The one that I work a lot with is this notion of third-party risk, and maybe not financial services clients, but certainly in other industries, a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning use is outsourced to vendors. How do you audit a vendor? How do you assess another company's trustworthiness, ethical use of everything from data to model choice, et cetera, when they have their intellectual property they're preserving, they're a separate entity, et cetera? So it's quite an interesting challenge, and we will absolutely see it in financial services quite a bit. Business process risk, so thinking of automation errors, how do we flag real-time risks? And especially we're seeing this in the use of AI and ML in fraud detection. It is frankly an incredibly fascinating field that is rife with a lot of potential harms to individuals, but also there is a very clear positive use case for AI in this case. And finally, technology risk. I think this weekend everyone was joking about how the governor of New Jersey put a call out for COBOL programmers. And, a lot of financial services industries are built on similar very old languages because they are incredibly reliable and stable. So the technology risk, as we start to encourage the movement into complex systems, using things like APIs, migrating to the cloud, what are the new kinds of risks that are being introduced? So with that, I'll pause and I'll give it back to Mona.
Thank you so much, Rumman. And we have Sarah up next.
Hi. Well, thank you, Rumman. That was wonderful. It actually brought back some memories before I went to grad school to get my degree in sociology. I worked for 5 years in the credit department of a derivatives firm. So it was all risk all the time. And in fact, when I was hired there, I was first hired to manage a Y2K database, a survey designed to see if counterparties were prepared for Y2K. So it was all about that third party risk. And really my, sorry, view slideshow, shall be set. Most of my work as a sociologist has really been about trying to understand all that work I did years ago in finance. Feels like a lifetime ago now. JP really does this beautiful work looking at the deep kind of organizational history of automation and financial markets. And my work concerns, kind of tries to zoom out further back in social context and US history to understand kind of how we got to this financial world in the first place and really think about what is the role of finance in the US political economy. I want to acknowledge here that we're talking about this at a time of incredible economic crisis, economic catastrophe that's unfolding alongside a health crisis. And in times of crisis, the ones that I've studied kind of throughout US history, we often see various claims made for how finance and now fintech can help solve problems. And I think we're starting to see some of those kind of claims being made now. So I just did a kind of a quick Google search. This is something from March 18th from American Banker about how financial technology can help during a crisis. I want us to think about these kind of claims in terms of a broader context, and in doing so, I'm going to draw some lessons and examples from my larger body of work. I spent over a decade looking at the role of the US government in financial markets. I'm interested not just in how the government orients to financial markets as a regulator, but also how it often participates very creatively and entrepreneurially in markets, and including financial markets. So a good place, I think, to where I start and to start some of this conversation is to think about kind of some longstanding myths and understandings about the US economy and how it works. You know, there's this general idea that the government, US government, is mostly hands-off when it comes to the economy, that it may step in during a crisis. The really big breakthroughs are the stuff of private initiative. Now, depending on who you are listening to this, you might not believe this at all or really believe it. But either way, hopefully you recognize it as kind of a dominant popular idea. Now, there's a tradition within economic sociology and kind of interdisciplinary fields, also political science and some economics, and definitely in history, that's kind of puncturing that myth about the US. Showing that while it's true that the US never had kind of a big centralized planning state like Japan or France, that never meant that the government was actually hands-off or that companies kind of made it on their own. These researchers have dug into the American state and found kind of case after case of a very kind of active risk-taking, forward-thinking government that's involved in markets. But that works very differently than the kind of a European planning state does. So Fred Block, who's one of the authors of that book in the middle, State of Innovation, says America really has, the US really has what he calls a developmental network state. The government tends to often work from the bottom up in a diffuse way, usually through brokerage, to help kind of advance technology and new ideas.
Sarah,
Mariana, yes?
we cannot see your slides.
Oh
It
no!
worked beautifully though, so far.
Hold on, view. Let's try this again. Is my screen still sharing? Yes.
Well, we see you.
You see me, but not the slides?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hold on. Share screen. All right. No, it's that you still see me. It says that
No,
I'm
we
sharing.
We see the slides.
You see the slides now? Okay, my
Yeah.
screen is showing me. All right, view slideshow. Do you see the slides still?
Perfect, yes, thank you.
Okay, all right. So let's, thanks Mona for letting me know. All right, gather my place again. All right, so I want to talk about this kind of developmental state that the US has and turn to kind of the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist who wrote this book, Entrepreneurial State. That's wonderful. I recommend it if you haven't read it yet. Mazzucato makes the point that, in fact, the governments specialize in taking kind of big, game-changing risks, the kind that change entire markets and entire economies, the kinds of risks that private entrepreneurs often can't or won't take. This is a slide from her book. This slide is a diagram from her book, kind of pointing out that how many of the constituent technologies of the iPhone, for example, benefited in different ways from this developmental network state. Places like DARPA and DOE, Navy, CERN, NIH. So my work is a part of this tradition. What I do is I've kind of looked at the federal credit programs. Now, federal credit programs are programs that allocate money to specific groups and industries and generally work to promote credit markets. And they do this by issuing loans, guaranteeing loans, offering insurance, buying and selling loans, as in Fannie Mae, or generally incentivizing and promoting less lending. I think of the federal credit programs as the most interesting policy tool that most people haven't spent that much time thinking about. And even if people have thought about things like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, FHA or the Small Business Administration, they may not have kind of thought about the credit programs as a group and how they work, or as kind of a style of governance. Today, or as of 2019, it's definitely not the number for today, the federal government owned 1.5 trillion in loans and guaranteed another 2.7 trillion. That is the number that would be officially put on the books. That number alone would have left out about another 4 trillion in obligations through the government GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That number will have been completely blown out as of this week. I haven't had a chance yet to update these numbers, but the bailout will completely change this. This is one thing we see kind of regularly happening with federal credit programs, is they can take like jaw-dropping sizes during crises when they're mobilized as a part of a bailout. So for example, in 2009, the Sergeant Inspector General of TARP was asked to testify how much the US government was potentially on the hook in a worst case scenario for all of its financial obligations and guarantees. And the answer was $27 trillion, which at that point was 150% of GDP. And we're entering into arguably a much more extensive and severe case right now. So this is from the White House, the federal budget supplement that looks at kind of the development of the federal credit programs from the 1970s. And again, this doesn't include the GREs. 90% of what the government, of the numbers shown in this are from the housing programs and the school loan programs. Almost all the direct loans are school loan program or school loans, for example. But even that number, what I want to kind of say about this is that in less expensive ways or expansive ways, the US government has used these to kind of make more surgical but incredibly important interventions throughout the economy. And much of their importance has to do with the ways that they've been institution builders. It was the Export-Import Bank that led the way in providing mid-size overseas business loans, showing that it could be profitable at a time when most US companies would not do it. The early venture capital industry was a kind of a small niche business after World War II, when the SBA created investment corporations that were guaranteed by the government to help expand the business. Those corporations weren't that, the SBICs weren't that successful, but they did help kind of train a generation of people who would go on to become very important in venture capital. America, the long-term amortized mortgage was kind of sometimes used, but not extensively used in the US until the farm loan system and the housing system popularized their use by throwing the government's support behind it. And a lot of my other work has kind of concerned how the modern securitization market was unable to be successful, was failing on private grounds in the 1960s, when the US federal government put its weight behind promoting securitization through Fannie and then through Freddie as a way to attract more capital into housing markets. So this is the kind of institution building that I mean. So the question I came to studying the federal credit programs was, why, even long before the financial turn, the US government kind of so powerfully moved in the direction of supporting financial markets. Why and how it chose the way it used, lawmakers chose credit as a policy tool. And to share a little bit of my answer for that, I think it's helpful to zoom into this moment, take a lesson from the New Deal. So if we look at the New Deal and the creation of the federal housing programs, we have a really revealing quote from Mariner Eccles, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, talking about how FDR was thinking about using credit support for housing programs at the time. It was not, the housing programs were being approached not just as an issue of keeping people in homes and avoiding foreclosures and homelessness in a way that we're thinking about exactly at this moment, but also as industrial policy. So let me quote Eccles. The significance of a new housing program that could revive the economy was not lost on President Roosevelt. He knew that almost a third of the unemployed were to be found in the building trades, and housing was by far the most important part of that trade. A program of new home construction launched on adequate scale not only would gradually help put those men back to work, but would act as the wheel within the wheel to move the whole economic engine. It would affect everyone from the manufacturer of lace curtains to the manufacturer of lumber, bricks, furniture, cement, and electrical appliances. The mere shipment of these supplies would affect the railroads, which would in turn need the produce of steel mills for rails, freight cars, and so on. This insight that credit could be this effective way, this extremely effective way, not just for the government to finance one industry, but kind of keep the economy moving, is important for a lot of reasons in US history. And just focusing on part of it, it can help us understand some of the political uses of credit in the American context. When you look at kind of this moment in the New Deal and other moments in the kind of history of credit allocation in the US, one of the things we see is that credit has a great ideological flexibility. By that, I mean it has a market form that involves the government. It can be justified on many different grounds. Now, this wasn't always the case. In the 19th century, government involvement in financial markets was much, much more controversial, and that changed for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons was that progressives, when they wanted to reform farm loans, farm mortgages in 1916, went to Europe and came back with this idea that credit support could be a way for the government to help people help themselves. That it wasn't a kind of a dangerous form of government overreach or paternalism, but really was very compatible with acceptable government action and with kind of a non-paternalistic, individualistic culture. My point, I want to be really clear about my point here. My point here is not that Americans universally love markets or hate the state, and so the government simply has to always hide in order to trick people into thinking that it's the market, which is an argument that is sometimes made. I'm actually arguing something different, which is that even people who tend not to like government action in markets can often get on board with this kind of action. And that lawmakers, when using credit programs, can usually plausibly speak in multiple ways. On one hand, talking about what the government is doing to help people, but on the other hand, continually dismissing and underplaying the kind of major programs like housing reform that kind of sets a new financial system for what's becoming the nation's biggest market as just mere market tweaks, small technical corrections, not much to look at, nothing that exciting. Credit report, they've also figured out by the New Deal that there are these real fiscal advantages, that these credit programs can have a big payoff for a relatively low outlay. So the federal government, by say issuing guarantees or insurance for mortgages, is able to evince this like massive change in not just housing, but in industry and consumerism and jobs for very, very low outlay. And it's related to kind of budgetary issues. It's easy to get off budget. And in fact, credit fit very well within the New Deal with existing racial hierarchies. The credit markets did not have been famously shown to have kind of reproduced racial inequality in the US in the kind of post-war era. In the New Deal, what that meant was that when Southern Democrats were blocking New Deal programs that they, like labor protections for farmers, that they thought would upset local racial hierarchies, they did not block the credit programs, which really could be counted on and could very easily support existing racial hierarchies. So all this is to say that kind of credit and finance had a particular, what I call political lightness, that made it a very useful policy tool. And one thing that happened because of that was it created an incentive for officials to define all sorts of problems as problems of credit allocation. So a kind of textbook example of this is to think of higher education. Say families are asking for more access to higher education. A government could potentially solve that problem in different ways. It could try to raise people's income so they could afford schools. It could raise taxes and build schools and have people go for cheap. Or it could do what we kind of have done now in the United States, which is define the problem of higher education access in terms of finance and create programs that help people get loans. And of course, this creates then a huge debt burden for families and also profits for lenders. I'm gonna kind of go through this. So this is the context where I want us to think about kind of how AI and finance can be used today and at these kind of particular moments. I am not at all against finance. Societies need financial systems and kind of need money to flow, or AI. Both have a place, but we need to be clear about what that place is and the much larger set of social forces. For example, kind of problems in the political system, kind of where there are veto points and problems with taxing and spending that are kind of forcing finance to the fore. Part of thinking about what AI and finance can do at this moment is really reflecting on what finance and AI should not be doing. I'll say this last bit kind of looking at it. We need to be very careful not to unreflexively reproduce talking points about finance that don't actually reflect the real reason we have a policy, which is that sometimes a better policy wasn't able to get through. We have to be consistently aware that in a society that has such a long history of relying finance for people to get basic needs like housing, education, and healthcare, that those rules of those markets, who gets what profits and who gets what risks, are those rules that are always consequential are extra so. And as we use AI and finance, we need to be honest about the role with ourselves, about the role that government initiative took in its development. And that's both on the technological development side of AI. For example, think of that Matsukato slide on the iPhone. And it's also on the finance side of kind of a long history of the US government keeping an eye on, promoting, orienting to, and participating in making sure American financial markets thrived and were kind of used in specific ways to solve social problems. So that if we do kind of continue this process of turning to finance as a way to govern, that we keep in mind that the wealth that comes from that is a wealth that we really did all help build. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And we can all join the panel now, which in this case means turning on the camera. Wonderful. Thank you so much, JP, Rumman, and Sarah, for these really insightful contributions and sort of laying the groundwork for what I hope will be a very interesting discussions on artificial intelligence and finance. So I'm just going to sort of start out, and while Team IPK is collecting questions from the audience, and sort of also feel free to ask each other questions. But I'll take chair's privilege and start off. So we've heard from Sarah, you spoke about sort of market tweaks as sort of little mechanisms that sort of change our social landscape and sort of this can change or reaffirm social hierarchies. And sort of JP, you've mentioned that actually the automation of finance was not a coherent political project. And then Rumman, we've heard from you how sort of risk management now is very central to actually doing that work within the financial industry. And so I wonder, in the context of the current pandemic, which is also an economic crisis, sort of using Sarah's last remark as a segue, if we think about artificial intelligence and automation in the financial industry, and we think about the incredible challenges that we are all facing, and we think about the significance of policy interventions that sort of create new market dynamics taken by governments, what sort of would be the best case scenario, let's say, for the United States? now, and I apologize if this is a little bit of a political question. And what would be the worst case scenario based on your research? And we're going to start from the back with Sarah.
The worst case scenario is that we uncritically redo what we did in 2008, set up a bailout that helps the wealthiest and underserves people on the street, that we continue to over-rely on finance to solve social problems and do so in ways that lead to increased leverage in the system and create cycles of booms and busts where families fall further and further into poverty while a group of wealthier gets bailed out and taken care of again and again. That's my worst case scenario. My best case scenario is that this is a moment, like a window of possibility for profound change, where we are able to think really critically about what finance should do and should not do, and start to do what Fred Block has talked about as understanding the ways that finance can be treated like a public utility. Thinking back to kind of the post-war era way of organizing finance, where we understood the parts of finance that should be really boring, that don't need to be for profit, that that can kind of work as a public utility, which and leave kind of the places where it is more cutting edge and exciting. Not that that doesn't ever exist, but that is kept, I think, to a much more kind of constrained social sphere, one that kind of doesn't dominate our society so much or create so much inequality. I would go pretty far, I think, with what I think the worst and the best is.
Thank you so much. Rumman.
Yeah, I'll echo Sarah, and I really love what she said about credit being used as sort of almost like a flexible political tool, and we see it already shaping in the way the U.S. has addressed, approached how to address this problem, right? So we're getting stimulus checks apparently that are really just, payday loans against our next income tax returns. But at the same time, I'm seeing my inbox absolutely explode with emails, through my various alumni connections, which are, institutions of privilege, on entire webinars on how to take advantage of the small business loans and all of the myriad new financial, benefits. But to your point, Sarah, these benefits, like who do they serve? I mean, they serve the alumni of MIT, Columbia, et cetera, who are already highly privileged. My guess is the, average immigrant laundromat owner is not being offered a webinar on how to adequately apply for SBA privileges and employee programs, nor maybe are they even aware. So I agree. So like worst case scenario is we sort of use this and use a lot of the quote public outreach as a veneer for really perpetuating the privileged economy we have. So then again, on the best case scenario, I think that this economic downturn is different from 2008. 2008 happened from the top down. This is happening from the bottom up. We're seeing the absolute decimation of our human-based supply chain. And, while everyone's being very noble on Twitter and applauding their Amazon workers and Instacart delivery drivers, I hope that this leads to more sustainable infrastructural change where these individuals and these workers are given the salary rights and protections that they deserve.
Yeah, so I just want to echo the comments that both Sarah and Rumman have made. I think that obviously in a crisis, the biggest risk is that you end up sort of going down a route that is then very difficult to extract yourself from. So anything we do right now can become a lock-in that we're stuck with for the next 30, 40 years. And given the current political situation, the odds of getting stuck with something that is not optimal are pretty high. So that's like the bad scenario. And at the same time, it's a very good moment to think about how we can decenter society from financial markets. I mean, the only reason why, or not the only reason, but one of the reasons why a healthy financial market matters is because so many lives depend on this very peculiar fiction and institution. If we had a stronger social security net, if we had institutions that are more resilient and less dependent on the fluctuations of this system, then we would be more resilient in terms of also addressing bottom-up crises. The problem right now is that as we depend, not only in terms of the services that we receive, which are financialized entirely, but also in terms of the futures that we have to ourselves that are given by the state of finance, then it's a moment where actually finance can, well, should be decentered in this and should lose this prominent position that it has in modern societies. Yeah. I mean, the positives, I have no clue about the positives. I don't want to say positives because I have no clue what's a good outcome right now.
Thank you, Sarah. You wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I wanted to add one other thing, which is, and I know from reading JP's work that like me, he has been influenced by the work of Karl Polanyi, and this idea that if you if we let markets kind of run roughshod over people's lives, market correction is this really bloodless term for intense human suffering. And we're about to see it, we're seeing it starting to play out now for homelessness, for hunger, for exposure to the elements, for illness, and in the case of COVID, for suffocating to death. Right. So to not have any kind of social support and to have only your options for dealing with that through the market is this incredibly is not this dry thing. It's one of the most important things in the world. And in response to that, people don't just sit and wait for markets to correct. People politically organize. And Polanyi's argument is that when people organize, you don't necessarily, if you don't take care of people, the organizational response you get when people demand protection from these kind of market corrections can be extreme. He argues, there's a reason why we go from kind of financial dominance to crash to the rise of fascism. We're already seeing the rise of nationalism. So it's on the table at these moments like this, and we are dealing with a downturn that is happening at a speed faster than the Great Depression. I mean, like these unbelievable social upheaval in the economy is that we don't risk just going back to the kind of existing system. If we don't take care of people in these moments, we risk much, much worse responses.
Thank you, Rumman. What role can automation and artificial intelligence systems specifically play in that?
Yeah, so now that we're heading into a recession, I think it's a big topic of discussion, where I work and at a lot of institutions, and a lot of folks are very concerned, especially about the adoption of technology. And there's sort of this upward trend in the adoption of AI, et cetera. And people are concerned that, investment's going to freeze up. I live in San Francisco, and that's pretty much the hottest topic of discussion is what new startup or what new company, how many people just got laid off, et cetera. But actually, I think that a lot of this will highlight and spur on investment in automation. Kind of the way we saw. So JP, what I loved about your talk is, I had sort of mentioned to Mona that I lived in New York around when the pits got automated, and it was interesting to see that shift. And the first future of work narrative was actually these pit traders, and traditionally these were like big scary guys recruited out of the military or who were like college football players because they had to be big, scary, yelly, and intimidating. And then it became people who were good in front of computers who usually were not that type. And to your point, like this wasn't politically motivated, purely financially and technologically motivated. The notion of the market completely changed because the notion of arbitrage used to be based on information asymmetry. The time it took to put in a trade versus the time it took for that trade to log was when other trades happened, and all of that changed. And I think what we're going to see with this crisis is that people are going to very deeply we rethink the fundamental infrastructure and how to use technology. And hopefully, again, and this is one of those, it could go either way types of scenarios. Like my hope is that people utilize it in ways that, reduce riskiness of certain kinds of jobs, reduce the insecurity of certain kinds of jobs. What I hope it does not lead to is, the impermanence of more and more jobs. I mean, we see the gig worker economy absolutely exploding, especially here in San Francisco. And there has been a strong and powerful narrative, which has, in the light of COVID-19, has actually increased in urgency on getting rights and protections for these individuals. So what I hope is that automation is used wisely in areas in which there are inefficiencies, where things are hazardous. And I sincerely hope that it is not used to render more and more people impermanent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things precisely about the issues with automation is that I think they mirror quite a bit the ideological lightness of credit and the political lightness of credit, in the sense that the way technologies are presented, as Sarah has sort of mentioned, is as solutions to these social problems. And the problem with automation in finance right now is that we are at a point where the modes of automation that have been prevalent in financial markets might just get sort of empowered even more because they're seen as adequate solutions. I mean, they did provide us for a while relatively okay markets. They had flash crashes now and then, but they were the most efficient markets in history. We had incredibly efficient equity markets for quite a bit of time, and a lot of that was predicated on automation. And getting developers, getting firms, and policymakers in particular to shift their sort of their paradigms and to start thinking about different ways of automating things will be the key challenge in a sense. Otherwise, I'm worried that we'll be stuck with just what we have today on steroids in the next decade.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask one more question myself, and then we'll turn over to questions from everybody who has tuned in. So, JP, you sort of talk about the tinkering and the maintenance and the sort of significance of standardization, about sort of how this happens in sort of, you say, club-like exchanges, which really did remind me of sort of the city of London. We both lived there, sort of its architecture sort of being like that as well, where, you would go in a pub and sort of close the deal there, and trade happened in these sort of ways that were purposely not visible. And so I do wonder, is the introduction of technology a way of, and specifically artificial intelligence, whereby we have this so-called black box problem, where we don't know how the tool got to its prediction. We don't know why the risk score is X, Y, or Z. Is that another way to make decisions and considerations even more invisible? And this is for all three of you, and then we'll turn over to the public.
So I think it might be, even though the trading floor was really opaque. I mean, you have to think about interactions in the trading floor. Even though we think of it as a public space, it wasn't a public space. As a regular person, you couldn't walk onto the trading floor and overhear conversations between two individuals there. And even transactions, when they happened, making sense of the logic of transactions wasn't obvious and wasn't direct. So there's always been opacity in financial markets. And I think that indeed, maybe artificial intelligence creates a different type of opacity, but it's still there. It's now a more technical opacity, perhaps, even though the previous mode was also technical and part of the way the culture is operated on the floor. But it's something that is now legitimized and made sense of in entirely different networks. So whereas before you had these club-like organizations on trading floors, now you have international conferences and meetings of people who are working in algorithms for AI that get together and talk about how you can sort of backtest your algorithms so that they are more resilient for X, Y, and Z. And in that world, there's a sense of transparency that actually doesn't translate to the outside. So I think that there's change is actually something really difficult to see in systems, and what you see is transformations of things that existed in the past, and the sense making that we see in markets on the floor and what we see in digital exchanges today is different, but not altogether drastically, dramatically separate. Yeah.
Yeah, to build on JP's point, it's interesting. You very accurately mentioned that these pits were not exactly open to the public, and I was sort of in the back of my head thinking, and you never wanted to be a woman on that floor. And it's an interesting parallel to the opacity of model building, which has its own barriers to entry, right? So now it's sort of these quants who have this very specialized skill set. It interestingly in financial services is a very male dominated environment, even though other parts of finance actually increasingly have more and more women. And that sort of disparity aside, there is also a very esoteric jargon that even me as a data scientist, I had to sit and learn. Like I learned what SR 11.7 meant, and the UK guidelines for stress testing, and I know what these things are now, but these are not common data science terms. They are very specifically existing at the intersection of sort of this data science, quantitative modeling, and financial services world. So it is a very, very niche world. There are only, really a few schools one goes to do this well. NYU is one of them. But, there are different barriers to entry, which compound on top of all the things that Mona, folks like you and I talk about when we talk about the opacity of AI systems. So this sort of kind of feeds into the socio-technical system, right? It's not just the model, it's the barriers to entry to even understand the model, to be in that room in model development, and be part of the conversation as regulators are trying to gain information on how to audit these models, for example.
Yeah, I remember when I worked in finance, the auditors would come and not even know the right questions to ask. And this was a system that was much like, before 2003 was much simpler than the world of AI that we're in now. And it does create these real organizational kind of problems, these questions of how do we start to build systems of regulation and oversight that can adequately deal with it? But I do think if we put the right resources behind it, it is doable. There are people who understand, and there are always experts who can kind of do the work of oversight and translation. But we have to kind of build a world where those people exist and are supported and are given some authority to do it.
Thank you so much. And we will be turning over to the audience. We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to ask only one panelist per question for the sake of time. So the first one is for Rumman, asking on SR 11.7 and how you see that as relevant for understanding model risk in domains beyond finance.
Oh, what a great question. So I learned a lot reading the SR 11.7 guidelines. It's not a terribly long document, so I do suggest people read it if you're interested in thinking through this whole principles to practice narrative that a lot of folks have in other industries. And it specifically talks about actions you can take at different areas of the model development process. And I remember when I was first reading it, I was absolutely floored that this document was written in like almost a decade ago, using the same kind of language we would use today when we talk about the kind of risk introduced by a model. So for example, it says things very specifically like, about data bias. It talks very specifically about model limitations and model choices, conversations that other industries have just opened up to in the last year or two. So the things that that are great takeaways. Number one is, what is a framework for risk? How do we understand risk? Number two, where are the different places it can occur? And then number three, what are the kinds of approaches you can take at different steps of the way?
Thank you so much. So I think the second question is good for JP. What do you think about the beyond GDP movement and the possibility to move beyond the status quo of single bottom line metrics for finance or economics? This includes OECD Better Life Index, UN Sustainable Development Goals, or Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index. Great question, JP.
Yeah, completely. So the GDP is, and in general, sort of the economics of growth and the emphasis that we have placed on how economies should operate has been arguably a tragedy, not only for societies, but for the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, completely. There's an important moment or an important opportunity to shift the types of metrics that we have to evaluate what is a good economy, GDP being one of them. Of course, the problem is that GDP is such an established measure that it's absolutely everywhere. So if the U.S. didn't move away from the imperial system, getting it to move away from getting a number of organizations and a number of professions to move away from the GDP as a key metric will be even more difficult. So it's something important. And the thing, I think that the test would be to develop sort of other infrastructures that are connected to these novel metrics that could compete in some meaningful way with existing sort of national accounts infrastructures and how they're used in different domains. That's a massive task, but it's an important one, of course.
Thank you so much. And we have one that I think is good for Sarah, which is a historical question. Has the Bretton Woods decision when the USA stopped backing the dollar on gold and began running deficits as a norm encouraged more reliance on automation in finance?
I almost want to bump that one back to JP because I feel like a lot of what I've learned about that is from his book. So I might punt back to him because I feel like I'm just going to do a warmed over secondary version of what he would say. But I will say that in terms of these, so we'll like switch, I'll steal his previous question. In terms of these other kinds of statements, I was doing research recently on Adolf Berle of Berle and Means, who was one of the authors of Modern Corporation of Private Property, this incredibly important theorist of shareholder value. And Berle talked about the need for a triple income statement. So if you look at kind of Berle had a whole, it was one of many people active in the New Deal trying to imagine other ways of organizing the economy and even kind of more radical or more progressive options that never kind of quite made it on to the agenda at the end of the New Deal. Berle called for a modern financial toolkit and wanted a system of credit banks that kind of do low interest rate lendings to small business. And as part of that, he wanted kind of a broader set of metrics to understand. So JP, do you want to take the Bretton Woods and automation?
So I can give it a little try. So maybe not. So one of the things that is interesting about post-1970s markets is that, of course, they were much more volatile. Volatility is good because that's where you make, if you're on the lucky side of volatility, that's where you can make tremendous returns. But if you're automated, that's precisely what you don't want. So let's go way after the 1970s. If you look at volatile markets in the world today, when a market is very volatile, that's precisely the market you do not want your algorithms to be working in. Because algorithms, like most artificial intelligence and like most sort of applications of that type, rely on relatively stable probabilistic worlds. If things are wacky, algorithms start getting things wrong. And that can be incredibly expensive. Knight Securities a few years back was an example of how a little glitch in an algorithm can cost you millions and millions of dollars in a couple of minutes. And in that sense, is automation a product of this shift? It is maybe in how individual firms address their investments in information technology, in communications, in the automation of certain types of activities like trading or settlement and so forth. But it might also be something that volatility, at least, that makes automation more difficult and less likely. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one for Rumman, I think. Regarding the new FICO algorithm, there are mixed reviews about whether this formula will actually improve or hurt people. What's your take on that?
Oh man, so all I know about sort of the new FICO algorithm is that if you've sort of taken on a loan to pay off debt, it decreases your score. And I know this because it affected my score. So my take on it, boo. No, I'm kidding. I cannot say I have enough knowledge, but I do think raising the notion of the FICO score is really interesting. When we think about, I raised the example of the Apple Card previously, and the whole narrative about it being a sexist model, and it was quite interesting because under the framing of AI and machine learning, it became a very popular narrative. And I think many scholars or anybody really who's been impacted by credit decision making can tell you it has been an opaque and biased process for a very, very long time. And one opportunity that interestingly has presented itself is this ability to maybe revisit how some of these models are built, and maybe structure them to be more fair and equitable. And I believe maybe about a month ago, we had the House Finance Committee meet and talk through ways of, addressing potential algorithmic biases. And like I said, I find that fascinating because, modeling has been used for decades in financial services, and nobody really talked about algorithmic bias in the way they're talking about it now. So it's been, we were talking, the first question was about positive and negative. One positive can be that a lot of the narratives of AI and bias, because it's so capture the public mindset, really allows us to address these older entrenched forms of opacity and biases. Sorry I didn't answer your question directly though.
Thank you so much. We're almost at capacity with our time. So let me close with a question for all of you. There are so many intersections between artificial intelligence and finance, not just loans and risk scores or high frequency trading or the market. There's also venture capital redlining, as Sarah has mentioned. There is government funding into research. There is fintech. There is the whole question around cryptocurrency. Do we need cryptocurrencies? And Sarah's smiling. We also maybe have questions around universal basic income that are more forcefully re-entering the discourse now in the context of the current pandemic. So there's this whole panoply of intersections when it comes to artificial intelligence in finance. Can I ask each one of you for maybe a word of hope, and where should we go next, and what should we read up on to sort of think more critically and productively of where to go next if we want to actively participate in that discourse? And let's start with Rumman.
Oh man. As Sarah very aptly mentioned, this is a time of massive upheaval, but also a time of massive opportunity. I think that there is this, ability to kind of question a lot of the systems and norms that we have. And if anyone were to read up on anything, read up on what, rights and privileges you're being afforded, and because guaranteed every company is, every privileged entity is doing it, and you should probably do the same.
Thank you. Sarah.
Oh man. I guess in the same spirit of what Rumman just said, one of the things that struck me most as I was reading about kind of credit and finance in US history was how many different kinds of experiments and ways people approached finance. And a lot of those kind of ways of, people have many ways of using finance to kind of help humans thrive, to share risks, to share profits among groups. So I guess I would say is, in addition to kind of looking through US history for kind of great examples. The early savings and loans, especially, at one point I got very interested in kind of farmers communal experiments with joint stock lending where they agreed to support each other's risks. There are also kind of amazing experiments being done today that are thinking about kind of different ways we can use finance. An example that I think about a lot is Beneficial State Bank on the West Coast, which found that when they gave to kind of low FICO score borrowers car loans at like a 3 or 4% interest rate instead of kind of a 30% interest rates, defaults were much lower, in fact, and that there were ways of kind of using credit that weren't kind of driving families into financial instability. So I think kind of keeping to look at it kind of historical and current experiments with different ways of using finance and thinking about them as we approach this moment of opportunity.
Thank you, JP. Last word.
So last words. I mean, I think it's a good moment to, what's the word? Domesticate markets once again. I mean, bring them back into our control to some extent. And of course, that requires seeing how they've operated in history, how sort of previous innovations that might have been interesting and positive failed and why they failed, trying to address what is going on in the rest of the world. And of course, trying to make them something that serves the common benefit rather than the benefit of a small fraction of the population. And not leaving a stone unturned and trying to see what is under each gear of the market is important, because it's all about the technical details in some way. So getting a grasp of those technical details and reading lots of critical data, literature, and sort of historical literature on markets and society is something that would be, of course, hugely important for that turning rocks.
Thank you so much. And with that, I want to thank you sincerely for your time, for your valuable insights, especially in this particularly challenging time. A virtual applause to panelists. I want to, before we close, also thank the team at IPK, Jess and Zari and Sam and Ari for making this possible technically and in any other way. Ellen and her team at 370J, of course, and the TCS department, Daniel Glabel, as always, for the generous support. We will be seeing this event fully captioned on YouTube very soon. Thank you, everybody, and we will end the stream here now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.